Hello everyone, I'm Russ Barkley, and in this video I'm going to continue to address the theory of Jordan Peterson that ADHD arises primarily because of a inopportunity to engage in play, specifically rough and tumble play, and specifically primarily for boys. The reason I'm doing this is that the initial video of mine on this topic has received far more views than just about any other video on my channel, probably at least 8 times more views, numbering well over 40,000, I think, at the moment. So it's been incredibly popular. Thank you. And secondly, a very, very small minority of individuals have criticized that opinion, believing that I simply hadn't presented sufficient evidence in order to refute what Jordan Peterson was saying. I find that interesting because none of them are asking Jordan Peterson for any evidence because he doesn't have any apart from a series of studies on juvenile rats done about 40 years ago. But that said, I thought that it would be incumbent on me to go back over and present in more detail what the evidence is and why we can resoundingly refute the ideas of Jordan Peterson with regard to lack of play as a primary cause of ADHD. So let's get the PowerPoint teed up here so that we can go through this. And I'm going to try to do so in a less emotional fashion, though that's very difficult for me because the claims of Peterson are so outrageous in contrast to the voluminous amount of scientific information out there that bears on ADHD and that refutes his idea, that one has reason to be outraged over someone holding such an outdated and outrageous view of this neurodevelopmental disability. So I'll try to contain that, and let's just stick with the major points of my argument as to why Jordan is not only wrong, but worse than wrong. And I'll explain that toward the end of this video. Peterson has claimed that although rare cases of ADHD may arise from brain damage, such as exposure to fetal alcohol syndrome, he asserts that the primary cause of ADHD is not biological at all. It's caused to limited opportunities for children, primarily boys, to engage in play, and more specifically, rough and tumble play. So he applies this primarily to males, believing that the majority of ADHD occurs in males. And while that is true in childhood, it becomes less and less so with age, such that by adulthood, females have nearly equal the prevalence rates of males. So that said, Peterson's ideas appear to have no bearing on females with ADHD, which is a striking omission in his assertions. The only research in the interviews that Peterson has done where he's commented on ADHD that he has to support this claim of lack of play is the research of Jaak Panksepp in the 1980s that took place mainly at Bowling Green State University. And I know about this research because I trained there, and Dr. Panksepp was on my dissertation committee. And after I graduated, we continued to correspond from time to time about ADHD, about my developing theory of ADHD as a disorder of executive functioning and self-control, and also about his ideas that limited or lack of play in children might be contributing to ADHD. So I'm quite familiar with Panksepp's work, which, by the way, doesn't seem to have been quite rendered accurately by Peterson, but that's neither here nor there. The fact is that I know about Panksepp's work, and we've talked about his work, and I've explained to him why I felt that his view of ADHD based entirely on his research on juvenile rats just simply would not hold up to serious scrutiny. And the more research that was published over that 40-year period of time, the more evidence accrued that Panksepp's idea just simply wasn't going to hold up. Eventually, by the way, Panksepp uh, seemed to have abandoned this explanation as cause of ADHD, but instead argued that because his research showed that by providing play opportunities to children, or excuse me, to rats who had been socially isolated, he was able to overcome the initial problems that that social isolation had caused. So he then went on to argue that regardless of the fact that there is genetic variation strongly contributing to ADHD, he felt that increasing opportunities for children to play might be one means of overcoming the incidence of ADHD in the population. So even Panksepp began to change his mind later in his career to some extent about the importance of social isolation in ADHD. And that's to his credit because the evidence simply wasn't there in human child research to support that idea. So Panksepp did go on to do some very fine work in demonstrating what brain structures within the rat brain appeared to be involved in their play behavior, and also showed that some of these brain structures might overlap with the brain structures responsible for ADHD in the human brain. We're going to take a look at that in a moment as well. And Therefore, Peterson argued that because of Panksepp's work on brain structures and their similarity to ADHD brain-related structures, that this was further evidence that the play hypothesis was correct. And of course, that's not the case at all. You can't simply crosswalk from one body of research on juvenile rats over to humans. But that said, that's the background that we're dealing with here. This is what Peterson is basing his ideas on, is a body of research that started about 40 some years ago by Panksepp and has now pretty much run its course. No researchers currently mention this body of research in serious discussions about the nature or causes of ADHD, other than Peterson, of course, and he's not an expert in this field at all. The evidence against Peterson is profound and numerous, and I'm going to have to just quickly summarize it here because of the time limits that I'm trying to set on these videos so that they can be viewed in short periods of time. First of all, Panksepp assumed that the aggressive play of juvenile rats that then helps them to establish dominant hierarchies within their social group is akin to the self-initiated forms of play, particularly rough and tumble play, in human children. That is a highly questionable assumption. Rat groups and human groups engage in extremely different social forms of interaction. And while both may be social in the sense that they congregate in groups from time to time, the nature of that social structure is very, very different. So Panksepp was measuring the extent to which these rats engaged in very aggressive play to the point where they were, in essence, play fighting, and then one would pin the other rat, and that would be the sort of demonstration of their dominance over that other rat, and then the play would discontinue. So rats engage in our juvenile period in a lot of different forms of play, but especially this kind of physically aggressive fighting with each other up to the point where one pins the other, and then that round is over. They do this in order to establish a power or dominance hierarchy in the eventual social group that arises out of these juvenile rats. So it's very much a power hierarchy of aggression that is involved in these social groups. And the play helps to establish who's more powerful than whom, and therefore perhaps limit actual fighting later within the social group, since each rat knows its place from this play period in this power and aggression hierarchy. Uh, as we will see, that is not how human children go about their forms of play. Neither Panksepp nor Peterson, by the way, ever presented any evidence that children diagnosed with ADHD had less opportunities for play, and particularly rough and tumble aggressive play, than do typical children. And the reason they didn't marshal any is there isn't any. When we look across studies on the early social development and family functioning of ADHD children, we find no evidence that these children were locked in their bedrooms the way these rats were locked in their cages and isolated from all other social interaction that then went on to have this effect on these rats, increasing their aggressive play behavior when they were released, which, by the way, Peterson doesn't mention, was a very temporary increase in their aggressive play behavior and activity level, which upon further social exposure led to a diminution in those problems. Peterson doesn't talk about that aspect of Panksepp's work. So, no evidence that you can crosswalk from juvenile rats to human play because the nature of the play in these rats is highly aggressive in order to establish a dominance hierarchy, particularly among males. That's a very different social structure than what humans have been doing. Panksepp at least acknowledged in 2006 that his theory would accept the very strong evidence by that period of time that there was substantial genetic variation that was leading to ADHD within the population. But he did indicate that his theory might encourage us to incorporate more play opportunities in the lives of ADHD children in hopes that it might help diminish or eliminate their ADHD and therefore reduce dependence on psychostimulant medication for their management. Again, this was never picked up in any serious way by human researchers studying the clinical disorder of ADHD. Peterson, by the way, never acknowledges this shift in Panksepp's view of the importance of his research and where it fit in to the accumulating thousands of studies on ADHD. Peterson just doesn't acknowledge that at all. Peterson also did not acknowledge the substantial problems with generalizing from the kinds of rough and tumble and aggression in play behavior that rats demonstrate over to extrapolating that into children and how human children play. You simply can't go from one to the other without demonstrating the causal chain of connectedness here. Otherwise, what you're saying is their play is identical to human play, and there you go. Well, it isn't. And it's incumbent upon Peterson or anybody who would propose this idea to demonstrate that link. Where do we see evidence of these similarities? We simply don't. And that's because the nature of these societies between rats and humans are very, very different. Peterson also does not acknowledge the difficulties in extrapolating from a rat brain to a human brain. They are profound, despite the fact that both rats and humans share a very, very distant ancestor within the mammalian line. That's about the level of similarity here. The human brain, going through mammals to primates to variations on humanity earlier in the history of our species. There were many different species of humans, all the way up to the modern human brain. A lot has gone on here in brain development. And that has led to an increasing complexity in human cognitive function that simply isn't represented at all in the psychology of the rat. The human brain, particularly the front part of the brain that is believed to be implicated in ADHD, is involved in incredibly complex executive functioning and preparation of behavior toward a future. It is not simply the seat of hyperactivity, which was thought to be the major symptom of ADHD back in the 70s and early 80s when Panksepp was doing his research and thought that an increase in hyperactivity in rats was akin to the phenomenon clinically of hyperactive child syndrome because of the hyperactivity. Well, of course, that turned out to be false. Hyperactivity is but a minor symptom of ADHD and a time-limited one during development at that. It is not the major symptom, which we know now is involved in executive functioning and self-regulation. So let's just back up here and let me show you. This is the kind of play behavior that Panksepp was measuring. He would isolate these rats for a period of a couple of weeks away from all social influences during their juvenile period and then release them into cages with other rats and measure their fighting behavior. And that's what they're doing. It may be play. They may not be leading up to physical injury of the other person, but make no doubt about this, this is aggression. And so you can see then these rats are engaging in a wrestling match. Eventually, the stronger rat and more agile one will pin the less powerful rat on its shoulders, at which point the wrestling match ends and the two have demonstrated their relative ranking within their dominance structure. That's how rats play. That's what Panksepp was studying. That's what happened when these rats were isolated. They didn't get the opportunity to do this at more typical levels of rat behavior. So when they were released from isolation, there was almost a rebound in aggressive play behavior that then settled down as these rats had more and more social exposure. So because they were aggressive and because they were hyperactive upon release from isolation, Panksepp was arguing that this might be an animal model for hyperkinetic reaction or hyperactivity in children, which of course it turned out not to be particularly fruitful for contemporary research. This is a kind of play that children engage in. It's social, it's interactive, and it's, notice, largely cooperative. It may start out as parallel play, where 2, 3, or 4 children are doing the same thing at the same time in proximity to each other, but it doesn't take long for this to start to become highly interactive play. And notice something here that we do not see over here in rats. Humans engage in play that involves cooperation, learning to share, take turns, follow rules, when to concede, when not to concede, sportsmanship, if you will, and so on. Because human societies are based on reciprocity. They are based on cooperation. And that is not the case anywhere near extent within rat social groups. Now, it may be that the frontal lobe of these brains is involved in these forms of play. No doubt. We know that the frontal cortex is a social cortex in our species. But that is pretty much where these similarities probably end. And certainly, neither Panksepp and especially Peterson acknowledge these profound difficulties in extrapolating from this kind of aggression in rats over to this kind of play at social cooperation among humans. You just can't crosswalk from one to the other like that. Also, you can't crosswalk from this brain of a rat with very little cortex, particularly frontal cortex, and much more of it given over, that is brain structure, to these other cerebellar brainstem striatum, and other structures. That's the rat brain. The human brain is probably over 100 times larger, and it is covered in this cortex. And that cortex is also covering up striking enlargements within these other brain structures. These brains are not in any sense equivalent nor synonymous. What this rat brain has to do is rather simple relative to what this human brain has to do. We know that the frontal lobe is involved in speech and language. Not so over here. There is none. We know that this frontal lobe is involved in internal speech, thought, talking to ourselves, and the process by which that becomes internalized. And you know from my theories of executive functioning that the other executive functions are forms of public behavior displayed to the world that becomes turned on the self and gradually internalized through suppression of the peripheral nervous system. That rat brain does nothing of the kind, and that is a substantial difference. This brain has to go on and evolve in order to engage in social cooperation, social reciprocity, turn taking, bookkeeping, accounting, exchange, economics, all of which involves a profound degree of self-regulation. More importantly, the frontal cortex is the time-binding cortex in humans. It is what gives us our intentional behavior. It allows us to look ahead, anticipate a later phenomenon, and then prepare behavior toward that goal, that future, in preparation for it to arrive. The human brain is a forward-looking, time-binding intention machine. The rat brain does nothing of the kind. I could go on and on about the differences between this brain and this brain in its cognition, its psychology, its functioning, and its evolutionary purposes. So while there may be rudimentary similarities between these brain structures because we share evolutionary relatives in an incredibly distant past, they are not equivalent. And to talk about what affects one as automatically extrapolating to affecting the other in identical ways is not serious science at all. It requires that you bridge those gaps, and you haven't. It would have been better for you to have studied, Jordan, primates and their play and their children. But even then, the human brain and what it functions to do goes light years beyond the primate brain in anticipating futures. After all, rats don't have culture, they don't have art, they don't have economics, they don't have money, they don't have government, they don't have all of the benefits that come from this highly complex, forward-looking, intentional brain. So that should refute this idea that what was found in a juvenile rat brain when it couldn't play aggressively with its peers can automatically be extrapolated to the incredibly complex disorder of ADHD arising from this very complex brain structure that gives humans self-regulation. I also talked initially in the video about the genetic basis of ADHD, resoundingly refuting Peterson's point. Here again is some of that evidence. There are hundreds of twin studies comparing identical and fraternal twins. These studies involve tens of thousands of twin pairs. These studies show a strikingly similar pattern to their results. It is one of the most reliable and robust patterns of findings in our research on the etiologies of ADHD. What does that show? And I know some of you questioned whether twin studies could serve as evidence. You need to go back and take Psych 101 and study what we know about the methodology of using twins. It is very well established, as are its assumptions about drawing inferences about genetic versus environmental influences on human traits. So what did that research show? As I argued earlier, it shows that the extent to which genetic variation, known as heritability, the extent to which these traits are genetically influenced by patterns of inheritance, is 70 to 80%. That is to say that 70 to 80% of variation among individuals in their degree of ADHD-like symptoms is accounted for by variation in their genetics. And in studies of clinical populations of individuals, that figure has risen to as high as 90% in some studies. So the more severe cases of ADHD that get into clinics, the more likely we are seeing genetic variation accounting for a large percentage of that severity in that trait. What does that leave? The next thing we can calculate in a twin study is the extent to which the rearing or shared environment contributes to that trait. In ADHD, it is 0 to 6% and not statistically significant, which is to say that rearing environment does not influence variation in this trait that leads to ADHD. Case closed, Jordan. That is where the lack of opportunity to play would have been found in our scientific evidence. The twin studies refute that idea. It is DOA, dead on arrival, because of these many, many studies against it. These twin studies further show that there is a small contribution of unique events known as non-shared environment, events that only one child in that family may have experienced and that might contribute to variation in the trait. How much? About 10 to 15%. But hold on. A portion of this, probably half of it, is due to unreliability of measuring the ADHD and the environment. It's measurement error. So we can remove that and say that maybe 7 to 10% of variation in ADHD is not genetic, but due to unique events. Well, we know what those might be. We know about the prenatal problems, the exposure to alcohol, the prematurity, the lead poisoning, the head injury, and all of the other assaults on the human brain that can go on from the point where it first starts to form in utero across the lifespan. This is a hazardous environment that we live in. And those hazards, if they impact in any way the development of the executive networks of the brain, can contribute to variation in ADHD symptoms in the population. It's easy to understand. There's a small, non-shared environmental effect in ADHD, and we have a pretty good idea about what that is. What does all of this mean? ADHD cannot be due to the family environment. We refuted that 20 to 30 years ago when these twin studies first started to appear, and it has been refuted every time another study is published. So this effort to blame the family for causing ADHD through lack of play opportunity simply won't stand up to the evidence. We also have thousands of studies now that took this heritability lead showing the strong genetic variation and went out to find the genes for ADHD. We have entire genome-wide scans of human DNA in thousands of people with ADHD and thousands of typical people. And these genome-wide scans have helped us, along with other genetic research, to begin to isolate the genes and their locations on chromosomes that seem to be contributing to variation in these traits. People with ADHD have different variants of these genes than typical people. And each little gene variant contributes a small degree of risk for symptoms. ADHD is polygenic. It takes multiple genes added together to produce this variation in this trait, and the extreme of that variation that is ADHD. There's at least 22 of these genetic variants already identified. Probably another 20 are in the works. But we can already do research in which we count up how many of these 22 gene variants do people have to create what's called a polygenic risk score. We now have many studies out there using these risk scores to show that they are directly predictive of severity of ADHD, of degree of ADHD in relatives, of comorbidity with ADHD to a certain extent, such as with autism or with depression or anxiety and other disorders, because they share genes with these other disorders. We can also take polygenic risk scores and show that they contribute to degree of intellectual development, to early death, to early parenting, that is, early childbirth within families, to medical problems that we see in people with ADHD, along with other risks for health conditions such as obesity. All of these have been found to be related to these polygenic risk scores. If Jordan Peterson is correct, we should have found none of this. The twin studies would show a massive effect of upbringing and family environment. There would be no evidence from studies of genetic variants showing any of them contributing to ADHD, because after all, it's play. There would be no evidence for polygenic risk scores contributing to ADHD severity and all of these other associated conditions, as we now know. And now we have evidence to show that these genetic variants have direct effects on brain networks, brain network functioning, brain structure, and we know by virtue of other studies with animals that these particular genes are involved in cell growth, cell migration to other points of the brain, the degree of synaptic connections when they get there, functional connectivity, and that these variants that are related to ADHD result in variation in these brain networks, regions, and especially functioning. None of that would occur if Jordan Peterson is correct. We would see none of it. This would be a waste of money, time, grants, investigator resources, and so on. But it isn't a waste, because all of this is established fact. So yet again, we have a profound body of evidence to overturn or refute Peterson's idea. I mean, after all, look at these images of brain development in ADHD, the degree of cortical immaturity or failure to grow in children followed for 10 years and serially imaged their cortex. What about these subcortical structures that involve the basal ganglia, the caudate, the putamen, and so on, the striatum? They all show, in blue here, the degree of underdevelopment of this essential structure involved in executive functioning and in ADHD. Then there is the cerebellum, where we have substantial evidence comparing typical and ADHD individuals, showing where within the cerebellum there is maldevelopment and smaller development in people with ADHD. So that the circuits involved in executive functioning and ADHD are highly complex, highly integrated, as you see here from this diagram from the Washington Post article some years ago on executive functioning and ADHD. And by the way, we don't see this in the rat brain to anywhere near this degree. So we have genetic evidence, we have neurological evidence, we have lots of other evidence to demonstrate that Peterson's idea is wrong. This is why no contemporary scientists or theorists currently studying ADHD today give any credence or even mention of lack of play as a cause of ADHD. It simply isn't so. And that is why Jordan Peterson is worse than wrong. Richard Dawkins invented that term to account for when we have disagreements where somebody is correct and somebody is incorrect. Okay? That's a disagreement where I make a prediction about a study, a colleague makes a different prediction, we go out and test the idea, the evidence comes in, one is right, one is incorrect. That's what we mean by wrong. But when thousands of studies exist that have already been done to show that your position is wrong, right? And you continue to espouse that position anyway, you are worse than wrong. You are nonsense on stilts. And that is the situation we have today with regard to Peterson's claim about play and ADHD. Now let's wrap this up with something I didn't mention in the last video, but was part of my outrage, my, if you will, anger at this idea of Peterson's, and that is, who are you blaming? Who is responsible for this lack of play? Jordan, right? It isn't society. Society doesn't raise children. Parents, families raise children. So by implication, what Jordan is saying is the parents are to blame. This is their fault. And by extension, because the school starts to come into this, eventually Jordan goes on to blame the mind-numbing, as he called it, educational system that won't let our children play enough, right? So here we go again, blaming parents and schools, as we did back in the 60s and early 70s, for ADHD. Peterson is simply wrong when he asserts that lack of play is the problem, because he's wrong in blaming parents for this behavior pattern in their children. This is a return to the days of parent bashing. And society, especially Western society, loves to do this. And we know which parent we're talking about. It's mothers. And we've seen enough of this mother bashing, Jordan. Enough. We're not going back 50 years to the days of Bruno Bettelheim, who blamed autism, another neurodevelopmental disorder, on cold, unloving, refrigerator mothers. That was Bettelheim's idea. Blame the family. Blame the parent. But his status, like Jordan's, was so high among psychiatrists and psychoanalysts that people bought it. They believed that this was the cause of autism. Families were told that this was the cause. Treatment programs were set up that excluded parents and then eventually worked with them to teach them to be more loving parents. The amount of cruelty that occurred during that era of child psychiatry and Bettelheim's ideas is unfathomable. Just read the book A Different Key if you want to read what happened to families of children on the spectrum back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It is unconscionable. And we are not going back to that kind of idea when it comes to ADHD either. Parents are not to blame for the way they raise their children, leading to ADHD in the population. So we cannot allow celebrities like Peterson to champion these worse than wrong ideas about a neurodevelopmental disorder, the implication of which is that parents and eventually teachers are to blame for this condition. That is a retrogressive and a morally offensive and a scientifically wrong theory about ADHD. And it deserves to be put back in the dustbin of history where it belongs. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you'll agree with me, and let's make sure that we overturn this idea in our society. Thanks so much.